welcome to really our series of William C. Powers webinars. My name is Peniel Joseph, and I am the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics at the LBJ School and a professor of history here at University of Texas in Austin, and serve as director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. And we are a mission-driven anti-racism center that does research and social impact policy around issues of race and vulnerability. We are really pleased to have with us today Dr. Pedro Noguera, who is really one of the world's leading experts on education and education policy and combating structural racism in education policy. I'll give a brief introduction and then turn it over to Dr. Noguera. And after his keynote, and there's going to be some slides as well, we're going to have a conversation, and we're also going to take Q&A. I hope this is going to be a webinar that's very action-oriented. Obviously, we're talking about education and educational disparities and racial disparities in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're having this webinar purposefully right before the start of the school year, as so many families are being challenged in terms of what to do and how best to educate and safely educate their children. Dr. Pedro Noguera has just been named the Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. Dr. Noguera is one of the world's leading experts on education. He's a sociologist, education researcher, and former public school teacher. Dr. Noguera specializes in how social, economic, and demographic factors influence schools and student achievements. And he's served in past capacities as Distinguished Professor of Education at UCLA's Graduate School of Education. And he's held tenured and endowed positions both at New York University, Harvard University, and the University of California at Berkeley. So we're really honored to be hosting Dr. Noguera. Before I give it over to Dean Noguera, I want to say that the William C. Powers Speaker Series is a series that we have thanks to the generosity of Jeannie and Mickey Klein. And really, we have so many different partners and donors who've been supportive of the center and our mission right here in Austin and nationally. And I want to thank them all sincerely. So now, without further ado, Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Hello, Peniel, and thank you for inviting me to join you today on this webinar. And although I guess it would be nice to be together there in Texas, but at least we're using this virtual medium to share some information. So I'm going to spend the time today talking about structural racism and how it impacts education. And the race, as we know, is getting a lot of attention right now for good reason, because of the police killing, starting, I guess, most recently of George Floyd, but we know that's part of a much larger pattern. And that's raised awareness about the nature of racism in America. And we see, Confederate symbols being taken away. And I would say, though, that a lot of the attention recently, aside from the police killings, which are obviously of great importance, there's been a lot more attention on the symbolic aspects of racism than on the substantive. And by substantive, I mean the deep historical roots and the structural roots, which are very much alive and well today. So I want to spend the time today talking about that because they have real implications for American education. And I think that unless we address them, we're not going to see education used as a resource to produce greater quality in this country. So if I may, Emily, if you don't mind putting the slides up, I'm going to use a report that we issued when I was still at UCLA on the state of Black children in LA County as a way to talk about structural racism, because what I think the audience will find is that many of the issues we discuss in this report resonate because they're not unique to Los Angeles. They are very much American issues. And we released the report right at the time when the state had just released its achievement data, which showed that among all groups in the state, Black students had not shown any improvement. And so the question was why? Why were Black students not improving in their academic performance? What was that about? And we wanted to show and shed light on how what was happening outside of school impacts what happens to children inside of school. Now, and I should preface this by saying, No Child Behind, which most listeners will be familiar with, which has been education policy in this country since 2001, since it was adopted by the Bush administration, and I should point out, bipartisan support. Democrats supported it. Ted Kennedy in the Senate, George Miller in the House were authors. And Texas, and the Texans out there will know, No Child Behind was really based on a lot of Texas policies to support achievement. But what the law did was it drew attention to racial disparities, right, because it required school districts to disaggregate data on test scores, but it gave no guidance at all on what to do about those disparities. What's more, it didn't offer an explanation for why those disparities existed. Now, here's one of the things we know. The disparities we see in education mirror this other disparities in our society, such as disparities in income and wealth, disparities in access to healthcare, right? Disparities in access to lawyers and the criminal justice system. And the reason why that's important is because in so many ways, the achievement gap, as we've called it, is nothing more than an educational manifestation of racial inequality in schools. And if you don't understand it that way, what you end up doing is fixating on how to boost test scores when overlooking all the other things that are happening to kids. And so one of the reasons why I think we've made so little progress is that we haven't addressed those issues. So if you could advance the slide, please. I want to start by pointing out that racism, as we've known it in America, takes many different forms. And I don't regard this as an exhaustive list, but it's important to make some distinctions here. Most of us are very familiar with what we call interpersonal racism. That's the kind of bigotry that's kind of in your face that you encounter from bigoted individuals. It's real, it's pervasive, it's related to bias and racial hatred that's been with us for a long time. But that's just one feature of racism. I think that after President Obama got elected, many Americans thought we had entered a period of post-racialism. And it was because they saw many white voters in predominantly white states had elected a Black president. And so I want to acknowledge there has been some improvement in this area of interpersonal racism, but it's only one dimension. The other dimension that's equally important and in some ways more insidious is what we might call ideological racism. And that's racism that is present in the media, it's present in our textbooks, it's present in the way in which we think about things. So we tend to associate being Black with negative stereotypes, such as a Black neighborhood is going to have more crime, Black people are going to be more likely to engage in criminal activity. Those assumptions, those stereotypes are rooted in an ideology about race that's sometimes not made explicit. There were times when they were explicit. Eugenics is one of the ways in which explicit ideological racism took hold in this country. But today, those beliefs are more insidious. They're reflected in media, and they're reflected in the ways in which we tell America's history through in most of our schools. Also very important, but ideological racism is, again, just one part of the problem we're dealing with. Then there's what we call institutional racism. And I think to educators, to professors like myself and Dr. Joseph, this is what we know very well, that is that even in institutions that are ostensibly committed to serving everyone, we see certain patterns of treatment which place certain groups at a disadvantage. So I'll just use schools as an example. We know that in many schools throughout the country, Black children are more likely to be suspended from school than other groups. When you look at the data, and there have been several studies documenting this, including in Texas, what we see is that they're often suspended for offenses that do not result in suspension for other children, that are very ambiguous, such as being disruptive or defiant. And we know that when kids are suspended, they're not learning, they're out of school. But what's important to keep in mind about this, that might be occurring even in schools that are led by Black principals or have Black superintendents and Black school boards, right? Because it's built into the operations of how those institutions operate, right? Many universities, for example, have trouble recruiting and retaining faculty of color. Even very highly qualified faculty often don't get hired in these institutions. That's also can be an example of institutionalized racism, because what happens is you have search committees that often have a preference for people who are like the members of that search committee. And so highly qualified people of color, women, often don't get the opportunity because they simply, the assumptions of those who are on those committees result in them becoming less attractive candidates. So I want to point out and acknowledge all these forms of racism are very important, but what I'm going to talk about today, structural racism, is in some ways the most insidious, because it's rooted in our history and it shapes patterns of interaction throughout our society in ways that we now accept as normal. So let me, if we could advance the slide, please. I'm going to spend more time on that. Structural racism, as I said, is rooted in a history of racial domination and in discrimination that, as we know, continued well up until the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Laws of the 1960s. But even after the adoption of civil rights laws, we still see aspects of that in our society. So redlining is one clear example where Blacks were systematically denied, and in many cases Hispanics as well, denied loans for housing, which led to the creation of ghettos, right? Think about this. Every major American city has a ghetto, right? We call ghettos a poor slum area, often predominantly made up of Black people. Now it might be more diverse. We have immigrants there as well. And we kind of accept that's just the American way of life. Well, all you have to do is go to Canada, and I don't want to idealize Canada. Canada is not by any means a society that's overcome racism. But if you go to a city like Windsor, Ontario, right across from Detroit, where you have a stable, thriving Black population, you have to ask why. Why is it that Windsor is not a ghetto and it's right across the river from Detroit, which is a dying American city? What's different about these places? Well, those of you who know Canada's history know that many Black people in this country, when they were fleeing slavery, fled to Canada, where there was no slavery, and were able to build a life for themselves where there was less discrimination. And therefore, you don't see the same kinds of housing patterns, same kinds of job discrimination as we've known in this country. That relates to the second point about structural racism, is that it's rooted in our economy. It results in people of color being trapped in low-wage jobs, the so-called essential workers that we're talking about now, who are putting their lives at risk to work in our nursing homes and supermarkets and hospitals. These are disproportionately people of color who often don't have good health care, who often are barely able to make ends meet. Why are they predominantly people of color? Because of a history and our history, and because of the ways in which we have allowed low-wage workers to be denied basic rights, such as the right to health care. So, you think about the meat packers and the agricultural workers in Texas, who are so vital to our economy. We know we could not eat without them. Why is it that we allow them to live without health insurance and without wages that allow them to support themselves adequately? Again, those kinds of racial disparities in education, in health, and income are all a reflection of history, but they continue very much into the present. And then there's what we might call environmental racism. And that too is a byproduct of structural racism. Think about the Flint, the water crisis, where there was lead in the water. that's related to a particular set of decisions that in Michigan, but it's also related to the fact that in many poor Black communities, you'll find environmental hazards, you'll find more pollution, more environmental degradation that affects healthcare, the health of the residents, and overall life expectancy. And this too is an example of structural racism. The last point here is equally important because this kind of racism is not dependent upon bigots being in charge, right? If you think about it, many of our major American cities today are led by, if not people of color, led by liberal Democrats, right? Across the country, that's the case. But even in those cities, many of the patterns I've described still are in place. And that's because they're rooted in history. And unless there's a concerted effort to address it, there's no change. So that's why it's too easy, I would say, to fixate on solutions to these kinds of problems that don't even scratch the surface because we don't really understand the nature of the problem we're dealing with. Please advance the slide. So this chart just reflects the pattern in test scores that I mentioned. The Black students represent the blue line, and you can see their scores have been going down. These are national data. And advance the slide. Yeah. And then this is California data showing similar patterns. And again, we're very familiar with this. This is what we call the achievement gap. Question is, why? What is there about being Black or being, in this case, Latino, that results in consistently lower achievement? Well, we wanted to expose what's going on. Advance the slide, please. So what we know is that despite improvements in graduation rates, and we've seen this around the country, and despite improvements in even college attendance for Black students, what we also know is that on a number of indicators like truancy rates and suspension rates, there's been no improvement at all. And so the question is why? Now, Los Angeles is a very interesting place to look at because the Black population in LA has been declining for several years. We went from a city that elected its first Black mayor, Tom Bradley, in the 1980s, to now a city where Black people, Black residents, make up less than 8% of the population. But when you look at the data, you will see Black people have the highest incarceration rates, the lowest life expectancy, the lowest or the highest infant mortality rates. That is on all of the data that's associated with negative life outcomes. Black people are at the top of the list. Advance the slide, please. So this is the data that examines college eligibility for Black students. And what you see is Black students have the lowest amongst all groups, lower than American Indians, lower than Latinos, and again, suggests something is going on with Black students that results in fewer of them being eligible for colleges and universities in the state. Advance the slide, please. And that's true, again, not just with respect to academic performance, but discipline patterns. And as you can see, for those I'll make the slides available on the center's website, but the patterns, again, show themselves up in suspension rates, chronic absenteeism. Black students by far have the highest rates of absenteeism. Advance the slide. And they have a much greater number of what we call adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are been linked to trauma. Trauma has a huge impact on child development. Black children have the highest rates of homelessness in Los Angeles County, and that's true around the country. Highest rates of children in foster care, more likely to have incarcerated parents, and as we will show, highest rates of asthma. Advance the slide. So a report by the Social Science Research Council was released last January, and it showed, used the Human Development Index as a way to kind of capture the quality of life for residents in LA County. And the areas that are darkest in this picture, this is a map of LA County, are the areas where the Human Development Index is lowest. That index is a composite of everything from income to education to health, And what it shows is that there's that dark cluster at the bottom, but also at the top, that Antelope Valley is where the problems are greatest. And because the index is lowest. Advance the slide. Now we'll see why it's the lowest. Well, these are also the areas with the greatest exposure to pollutants. Maybe not so much in the Antelope Valley, but down below, and those are the areas where there are freeways, where there are warehouses, and other manufacturing processes that contribute to poor air quality. Advance the slide. And as a result, more likely to have impact on the health of children. Much, much higher asthma rates amongst Black children than any other group. And that's linked to school attendance. Kids who are sick with asthma, more likely to be absent from school, for example. Advance the slide. So we also know that schools in Black communities are more likely to be under-resourced. That is, that we spend less on those schools, which means those are less desirable schools for teachers. So they tend to be staffed by underprepared teachers and underprepared principals. They also have fewer counselors, social workers, science labs, libraries, preschools. So all the things that we know make a difference for educational outcomes, you have less of those in schools located in poor Black communities. Advance the slide. So what our report showed is that Black children are experiencing what we call an accumulation of disadvantages. And these disadvantages, for example, having a parent who's incarcerated or experiencing food insecurity, start to impact a child's development and their academic performance, right? And this is the part of education that's not being addressed because it's seen as being outside of the bounds of education policy, but has a direct bearing on the performance of kids in school. Advance, please. So again, you look at the pattern on college readiness and you see the same areas that we said had the greatest environmental problems and highest poverty rates are also the areas with the lowest college readiness rates. Advance. And they are also more likely to be highly segregated. Now, keep this in mind. The Brown decision, 1954, unanimous decision, was supposed to end the practice of segregation in this country, racial segregation. When Thurgood Marshall was asked why Brown was so important, and he was the chief litigator for the NAACP, he said, because the money follows the white children. And the only way our kids will have access to the resources is if we make sure Black children go to integrated schools. With our own analysis, what we showed is that the Black children, Black students who are most likely to go to the University of California are attending integrated schools. Problem is, most Black children attend highly segregated schools. And therefore, they're not in the schools that offer the educational opportunities that would lead to college education. Advance. At the same time, in those schools, there's a greater number of kids who are homeless, greater number of kids who are in foster care. Advance. And greater number of kids who are hungry and other childhood hardships. I'm trying to paint a picture here. This is about the structure. This is about the way our society is organized and the way in which racial inequality gets reproduced over generations. Right? We've known for many years, for example, the strongest predictor for how well a child will do in school is family income. Family income combined with parent education is the best, strongest predictor for student performance in school. So if you think about who's getting into the University of Texas at Austin, disproportionately, it's going to be the wealthiest children from highly educated families. Well, what does that mean for Black and, I would add, Hispanic children? It means they're going to be less likely to have access to those kinds of opportunities. Advance. Now, many people say, well, poverty is the real issue. And I would agree, poverty is certainly an impact, and it shows up in the data, because what we've done in this country, not only haven't we expanded access to integrated schools, we've concentrated the poorest kids in under-resourced schools. So it's, in effect, we're not even living up to Plessy of separate but equal. We have separate and profoundly unequal schools throughout America. And Texas, I think, is a great example of that. The good news is that poverty is not a learning disability. There's absolutely, we don't have to wait till we end poverty to make sure kids get educated. However, if we ignore the effects of poverty on kids, if we ignore that these kids are hungry, that these kids need to see an eye doctor because some of them need glasses, that impacts reading. If we ignore those basic needs, what we're going to continue to see is the same patterns of underachievement. And I should add here, and this is something that I think many white Americans don't see, is that we are interdependent. Older white people who are retiring and increasingly dependent on Social Security are dependent on younger people to work to support that Social Security system. So we are interdependent. And I often say that the strongest advocates of educating poor children of color should be older white people because their future depends on it. Unfortunately, we don't see it that way. We tend to live in very fragmented society, so we think the problems of schools in poor communities are their problem, not an American problem. Advance the slide. So we set up recommendations, and we think that ideally we'd want leadership coming from the federal government, state government, local government to address this problem. Now, obviously, as we can see with the way the federal government responded to the pandemic and the fact they're pushing for schools to open without providing any clear guidance on how to do so, we're not going to get leadership on how to advance, how to address these problems from the federal government. But at the state and local level, we are seeing some progress being made. And that's what I want to point out, because the news is not as bleak as it might seem. Advance. So one of the best examples we know of across the country for responding effectively to the needs, the non-academic needs of kids, is the Harlem Children's Zone, established by Jeffrey Canada. It serves about 12,000 kids in central Harlem. It provides not only a high-quality education, but healthcare, preschool, parent education, music lessons, access to the dentist. It supports kids all the way through college. And it brings those college students back into Harlem to mentor the younger kids. The evidence is clear, it works. The challenge is, how do you replicate? Now, I want to point out here, Dallas, Texas has developed a similar kind of project in South Dallas, and it's showing great results. That is, by targeting resources into poor communities, you can start to improve outcomes. Advance, please. In Los Angeles, UCLA adopted the Horace Mann Community School. And at the time, I was suspicious about it because over 50% of the kids at this school were children with learning disabilities. But UCLA's poured resources in, so there are counselors, there are highly trained teachers at the school now. There are our enriched summer program, music program. And what we're seeing is that when you invest in these schools, in these children, outcomes can indeed improve. Think about this, because a lot of people say, oh, you're just throwing money at a problem. Well, you're throwing a lot of money at your prison system. And what are you getting from it? More crime, because prisons do not rehabilitate, they produce more crime. If we were to invest in education, it's not only cost effective, the long-term benefits accrue across a person's lifetime. They earn more money, they contribute more to society as a result. Advance, please. So what we encouraged was school districts to work to adopt strategies that make it less likely to suspend kids. What they call a multi-tiered system of support means responding with support when there are behavior problems, addressing the cause of the behavior problem rather than simply addressing the behavior. And we know that in many schools, it's the kids with the greatest needs who will get into the most trouble. If you don't respond to the needs, the behavior doesn't change. We also said you have to make sure that kids have access to the courses. We call them A through G courses. These are the academic courses you need to be college eligible. And then you have to make sure that teachers in those courses are well trained and that they have the resources to meet students' needs. We call for better coordination between county governments and school districts so that it's not left to schools to respond to the issues by themselves. They need to have social workers. You know, we live in a country where there are resources, and we've got to be creative about how to make that available. And then we've got to work with parents, because as we've seen during this pandemic, when parents are engaged and when they have the time to work with their kids, outcomes for children improve. We need a concerted effort to engage parents so that parents understand what they need to do to support their own children. Advance the slide, please. And so the school that epitomizes this strategy in Los Angeles is the King Drew Science Magnet. It sends by far more Black students to the University of California than any other student in Los Angeles County. And all you have to do is look at the school and you can see why. It's because it's associated with a medical school, Drew Medical School, and hospitals. Kids are getting internships in the health sciences. They get an enriched learning experience that prepares them for college and for life. And you know, the real issue is, why aren't there more King Drews? Why is there only one when the need is so great? Why haven't we made these kinds of investments in a city like Los Angeles, which has so much wealth? Advance, please. And so we have very specific recommendations about, for example, the need to hire more Black teachers. And I don't want to suggest by any means that being Black by itself is enough to be a good teacher. But the research is very strong now that when you hire more diverse teaching staff, particularly Black teachers, outcomes for Black children go up, and very importantly, for all kids go up. Because we know from the studies at Johns Hopkins, a longitudinal study over time, that Black teachers are more likely to provide this kinds of support, less likely to suspend kids, and build stronger, healthy relationships with their students. So we need to do that. We need to make sure we're expanding to access to after school and summer school programs. I often say that the same thing that middle-class kids get and affluent kids, that's what poor kids need. Poor kids of color need the same kinds of things. We need to make sure that there's collaboration between our universities and our local school districts. How is it? That makes no sense that we have so many excellent institutions of higher education across the country and so many schools that are struggling. Advance the slides, please. So the research tells us these are the things our schools should be focused on to improve. This comes from the University of Chicago, where they've studied school reform, and they've asked, well, many schools have been reformed, which ones got better? And which ones have had sustained improvement? And the schools that continue to improve have a coherent instructional guidance system. They've got ongoing professional development of the teachers, because the skills of the teachers have to match the needs of the kids. They've got strong parent-community ties. They've got a climate and a culture in the school that's student-centered, so kids feel valued, respected, and appreciated, and they've got shared leadership. Look at those five and ask yourself, do my schools, the children my schools might attend, do they have these five essential ingredients? And then ask, why isn't the state telling our schools, this is what you need to work on? Because if you work on this, you're going to see outcomes for all kinds of kids, not just Black children, improve. Advance, please. And so another example, the Watts Learning Center in LA. And here's the good news. I can name throughout America several schools where Black children are thriving. I was in Tuscaloosa, Alabama a few years ago visiting. That's home to the University of Alabama, as you know, great football team. Lousy school system though. In a city that's integrated, they have segregated schools. I was visiting Bear Bryant High School, named after the great football coach. And I was talking to the teachers about what's going to take to improve outcomes for kids. And I could tell by their kind of their looks on their faces, their posture, that they weren't buying anything I was saying. So I asked the question. I said, how many of you have ever seen a school where Black children are thriving, where they're doing well? And no one raised their hand. And I said, well, if you've never seen it, do you think it can actually be done? And no one raised their hand. I said, well, I could take you to schools where it's happening right now. And they said, really? I said, that's right. And they sent 7 teachers to come visit me in New York City. And I took them to Medgar Evers High School in Brooklyn, New York, where 95% of the kids go to college. And many of them go to the top colleges in the country. And the teachers were blown away by the kids and what they were doing, about the courses, the very challenging, rigorous courses they were taking. And then again, they had to realize the problem at their school was they hadn't done the work. They hadn't created the conditions that provide similar kinds of learning opportunities to these kids. So they realized the problem is not the kids, the problem is the way they treat the kids. That's the real issue. Advance the slide, please. So I think it's very important to keep in mind, it should not just be about schools. We need cities and counties to work together to address and respond to these environmental issues I've named, to the health issues, because our schools are overwhelmed. And too often we'll just lapse, into blaming teachers or think we can just fire the principal, fire the superintendent, and things will get better. And that never changes anything because you haven't changed the conditions. So cities need to work with schools, counties need to work with schools to improve long-term outcomes. Advance the slide, please. And just advance it again. And the state needs to play a role too. You can look at these and you can look at the report. We're going to be issuing a much longer version of this report in the near future, and probably a book on this topic, because as I said at the beginning, the problems in Los Angeles are not unique to Los Angeles. These are national problems that exist throughout the country. Advance the slide. I think I am done. One more time, advance. This is important. The United States made its most progress in reducing disparities when we were committed to a war on poverty. That was when a Texan was president, Lyndon B. Johnson. And what's interesting about Johnson, because he launched that war on poverty, he also launched Title I as part of the Great Society, a civil rights initiative, which brought additional resources to schools serving poor children. Lyndon Johnson was a teacher in South Texas, working with poor Mexican kids, seeing the effects of poverty up close. I have to believe that part of the reason why he understood that schools serving poor children need more is because of that experience he had in schools. But when we were committed to that, we saw gaps in achievement close. We saw greater progress in education being made. We also know that when we were committed to integrating our schools, we saw more progress being made. I recently wrote an article about that on my own education because I went to an integrated school. But increasingly, more children of color, particularly Black children, are attending segregated schools. So I'll stop there, Pernille, and we can open it up for some discussion.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Pedro. There's so much to talk about. I've got a ton of questions, but in the context, so many people on this webinar, and we have hundreds of people here, are parents and students and teachers, administrators right here in Texas. And you alluded to this before when you were doing the different kinds of racism: structural, institutional, interpersonal, and ideological. And so what I want to talk about for my first question, and we have a lot of Q&A, we have ample time, is what can we do? I think one of the interesting parts about this period we're in a crisis, but as you know, every crisis means we have an opportunity.
Exactly.
And so one of the things I've seen is that people want to help. The private sector, philanthropists. We know in some ways the last thing that's going to be fixed is the federal government. In a lot of ways, all politics are local. And so what can we do? And I think it was great, the slides that you showed, because I think people have been texting me about how much note-taking they're doing. Because I think it's one of the most easily striking things is how this George Floyd tragedy and this Black Lives Matter 2.0 moment has been the national conversation and education on race that we've been trying to do, Black people and brown folks, for hundreds of years, right? And people are taking notes. Anti-racist books are selling off the shelves, hundreds of thousands of copies per week, right? But people want to know, what can they do right here? We have the Austin Independent School District. You said there's something going on in Dallas that's a model. But right here, we have huge racial segregation in Texas. We have huge segregation right here in Austin. Austin's considered a liberal city. We're only 8% Black. Our kids are disproportionately concentrated in certain areas that have to do with the structural racism and institutional racism that you talked about so eloquently. So what are ways that parents, teachers, administrators, educators can tackle these issues right here, right now. We're going to break that down, but I want just, what do you think, especially in the age of the pandemic? Because the food insecurity you're talking about, all these different things, so many of our Black and brown kids do not have the technology to Zoom to school. So there's a real crisis. So many of them get their meals at school. They get mentoring at school. So many of our children are in traumatic home domestic situations. So we're in trouble, but I also think it's an opportunity. So what can we do?
So the main message here is don't wait for help. It's not coming. Help is not coming. You've got to take action where you are. So let me just talk a little bit about Todd Williams. Todd Williams is leading this initiative in Dallas. He comes out of the private sector. He was in finance, and he saw a problem in his community. He knew that South Dallas was the most segregated, poorest community in Dallas. And he said, that's where we need to focus resources, but we need to be strategic. They focused on literacy. They said, let's make sure all kids are reading at proficiency by 3rd grade. And let's make sure we get tutors in there. And because you know what happens? If kids are reading at proficiency by 3rd grade, you improve college access. You improve long-term outcomes with an intervention as simple as that. So we have good research out there of how to invest and how to intervene. The point is, don't wait to elect the right governor or the right president for this to happen. We can act now locally to support our schools. We have resources in most of our communities, and where we don't, then we need help to bring those resources in. But we can look at examples. I mentioned the Harlem Children's Zone, and I could mention several others where we are taking steps concretely right now to make sure we deliver a good education of kids.
That's great. And to break that down, I want to talk about anti-racism, because there's been such a big discussion about anti-racism. My friend Ibram Kendi's book is a bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Robin DiAngelo, White Privilege. There's just so much happening right now. What do you think, in what ways, and obviously the work you've done, even though you might not have branded yourself as such, has been about anti-racism your whole career, your whole life. So what can we do as parents, as teachers, as educators, as school districts, at the local level, not even asking for help from the state or the federal government, to try and institutionalize that anti-racism, to not just teacher training, but to go beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion? I've been saying this, and I thought you said this brilliantly with the slide when you talked about racism without racist, because we live in a country where everyone says, including the biggest racist, that they're not racist. And so what can we do where we go beyond just diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're really thinking about Black, Latinx equality, but anti-racism in our curriculum, from top to bottom, from stem to stern?
So this is the reason why I've been reading and I've been writing and speaking about structural racism, because what concerns me is that too often we only focus on things like bias. So I know many school districts that have invested lots and lots of money to bias training for teachers. Well, I can't name a single school district I know of that got better because they did bias training for teachers, right? And it's not because bias is not real. Bias is very real. I just don't know if you can train people out of it, right? And I also don't know if just because you go to a great training, will I become a better reading teacher? Will that improve the way I teach science or math? Because it's not linked. We have these abstract conversations about race, and then we have to go back to our work. How does that influence what I do and the way I relate to my students? So that's why I try to draw attention to the ways in which the structure and the way we do things, that's what's got to change. And it's not to say we don't need to address bias, but if it's not being addressed in the context of the work we do, nothing is going to change. So learn from the examples. That's why I took those teachers from Tuscaloosa up to Brooklyn, so they could see Medgar Evers. Seeing is believing, right? They have to know it's possible. Otherwise, what happens? In the back of their mind, they still believe these kids can't learn. These kids come from a culturally deprived, anti-intellectual environment. All the anti-racist training in the world is not going to stop that unless you actually give people tools to show them how do you produce better outcomes for kids. And so I get worried because I think we fixate on the wrong things. we stay in the symbols and we don't get into the substance of what needs to change to make progress.
Now, when you think about this notion of somebody has a question and it's connected to mine in some ways, where I wanted to talk to you about the trauma of COVID-19 on our students. And we have folks here in Austin who are doing things like philanthropists who are contributing to make sure students have meals because so many students are food insecure. They're trying to do stuff like purchase technology to make sure they're going to be connected online. This connects to the structural problems that you talked about before, but I want you to talk about, because you talked about Canada's Harlem Children's Zone, to talk about trauma, but wellness, self-care for children. Because one person, and I'll link it to a question, one person was talking about in the chat room, the Moynihan report, right? And saying that, well, what happened to the Black family, right? And I think it's important for us to tackle that head on because some people feel, well, it's the lack of Black fathers in households that is the problem, right? And somehow that's linked to poverty. And so people really connect Black educational disparities to these achievement gaps, what people call opportunity gaps, but they really connect it to family structure, right? And so I disagree and I push back against that, but what can we say to that person in the sense of, you know, the family? Because certainly now families look in multiple ways. We have family with 2 men, we have families with 2 women, we have a single, I was raised by a single Black woman, me and my brother is a doctor. So what can we, how can we link these traumas, this food insecurity, the lack of emotional health access that our kids face? And somebody has even talked about non-able-bodied students and race.
Sure.
How can we link that to, so much of the time, I think most Americans want to say, well, it's their families, it's the family's fault, right? And that goes back to the Moynihan report. And for everybody who doesn't know, the Moynihan report was a 1965 report by Assistant Secretary of Labor, future Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said that there was something wrong with the Black family, that it was too matriarchal. He blamed Black women. Instead of structures of racism, he said that the problem was this tangled web of pathology in the Negro family. And we needed to stop thinking about policies that were anti-racist. We need to fix the Black family. And a lot of people love that, and they still do. 55 years later, they love it. So I want to untangle that.
Yeah, this is, you know, one of the real problems we have in this country is we tend to blame the poor for being poor instead of examining how the opportunity structure keeps people poor. And you know what we don't recognize, for example, is there are a lot of poor white folks in America too, but white poverty tends not to be as concentrated, at least not concentrated in our cities, like Black poverty. But you know, you look, I've spent a lot of time in the Rust Belt, and you'll see where the opioid crisis is greatest, lots of white poverty, lots of white children. So many children right now in West Virginia, white children, being raised by grandparents because their parents are strung out on drugs. So poverty actually cuts across race, but we Americans tend to see it in racial terms. And we tend to explain poverty by blaming you know, in this case, the Moynihan absence of a Black father. Now, the truth is, having 2 adults who earn an income is certainly better than 1 adult, right? So you're not going to argue against that from an economic standpoint. But well, again, if we look at policy, the Canadians, I hate to hold Canadians up as an example, but they do things better than we do. They passed it was in the 1920s, they passed a law to support children. So every family who has a child in Canada gets $6,000 to support them, help them with their kids, right? Because they knew that when you would give families resources to support your children, kids are going to get better outcomes. They're going to be fed. They're going to be healthier. So, you know, I point out to people, Toronto has the highest performing school district in North America, right? What's different about Toronto than, you know, school district in the United States? Well, if a school is struggling in Toronto, they don't say we're going to fire the teachers and fire the principal. They actually, the Ministry of Education comes in and says, how can we help? Based on these scores, look like you need help in math. We're going to send people who know how to teach math to work with your school. They build capacity in their schools. So what we have to do is move away from blame and focus on what we can actually do. We get caught up in these battles about blame, critiquing the problem, and it actually prevents us. We get paralyzed, and it prevents us from pursuing solutions that are out there. And that's why it's so helpful to look beyond the United States for solutions, because there are many countries throughout the world that do a better job at addressing issues like poverty and racism than we do.
And that leads me to, you made a great point about the Brown decision. So the Brown decision in 2024, it's going to be 70 years since the desegregation decision, Earl Warren, Supreme Court, May 17th, 1954. And then a year later, Brown 2 says that desegregation should occur with all deliberate speed. And racial segregationists felt that meant never, and racial integrationists felt that meant today. What can we do, and what, in a practical way, again, what can local communities do to try to desegregate their schools? Because I agree with Thurgood Marshall, the resources did go where white students were, even to the point where we have different suburban school districts all throughout the United States that purposely annex themselves to themselves a small cluster. Some of these are white flight districts from the post-war period. Some of them are recent districts that create just new tax havens for themselves, where they're spending so much money per pupil, and make sure that the demarcation line is whenever and wherever Black people may reside.
Yeah, you know, this is a tough one because the will to support desegregation isn't there and the leadership isn't there. So I would say where it is there, so for example, is a district outside of Hartford, Connecticut. They have a magnet program that creates integrated schools. They got the best, they have the fewest gaps in achievement. It shows when there's the will, you can actually move outcomes, right? And the Department of Defense runs schools around the world. They have the fewest, the smallest disparities in achievement of all. So we can look at places where we've solved the problem, and what you see is integrated schools, excellent learning opportunities for kids. That's how you lift opportunity. If we're not willing to do that because of the resistance from affluent white families to integration, then you've got to invest in the schools in the poor communities. We can't wait for integration to solve this problem because clearly the will is not there at this moment, but there's a lot we can do. And so, I gave the example of Medgar Evers High School in Brooklyn. It's an all-Black school, but it's an excellent school. So we should not believe that simply because the school is racially separate and segregated, that it can't be a great school if we apply the resources that can make a difference. I can name several that have done that and are getting good outcomes for kids.
I'm going to ask one last question and open it up to the Q&A. When you speak about investment, and even when you speak about something like Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Zone, I want you to discuss with us what are the positives and the negatives, and we've seen it with the Secretary of Education, the current Secretary of Education, with this idea of charter schools and this idea of, because right now, because of this moment that we're in, there's many entrepreneurs, at times venture capitalists, who are saying, what can we do to help in terms of education? But they're not necessarily saying we want to build charter schools. They're not necessarily saying, and they're not necessarily saying we want to build charter schools that are going to take money from the federal government. Because when we think about LBJ, one of the things LBJ did with the Great Society in 1965 is pass the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which put the federal government in the business of providing grants. The only reason why the federal government has any, in quotes, say is because it gives about $15 billion a year, and really even more when you think about in-kind benefits, right? So what do you say about what can, let's say progressive capitalists, if that's a word, what can progressive capitalist entrepreneurs do at the local level, and why do some progressive educators push back against charter schools? You know, because sometimes people don't know, why is there this controversy over some, not Jeffrey Canada and Harlem Children, because we know, like you said, the proof is in the pudding, what he's done, but there's other places that have set up charter schools, set up their own metrics, non-union, they haven't necessarily educated, but you saw VC guys, hedge fund people get into the act because they were getting all this money from the federal government as well. So let's talk about that.
So I'll come to charter schools, but let me first address this issue of the enlightened capitalist. So think about this, because right now, some of the richest people in the world are testifying in Washington. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Apple, Google, Twitter, they're all testifying because it's clear they've made huge profits. They run monopolies, and how do we benefit? What they've done, if you're a custodian at Google, it's not like you're getting paid a lot of money. They contract that out. You can't even live more than 2 hours closer to your job because there's no housing. So let's think about the example of Henry Ford. And he was by no means a liberal or a progressive, but he understood his workers need housing near the job. So he built houses. He understood it was in his interest to make sure that his workers could buy his cars, right? And so he was an enlightened capitalist. Right now, why is it Jeff Bezos, Amazon, which makes so much money from people having access to the internet, why does it make sure that every household in America has internet access? And every kid has a screen so they can do the work. They have the money. He's never going to be able to spend $1 trillion in his lifetime. What's he doing with all that money, right? So we don't even have enlightened capitalism in America right now. We have a very predatory kind of capitalism that's hurting us and is not sustainable. Which brings us to the issue of charter schools. I'm not against charter schools. I'm not against any school that serves kids well. The problem I see with charter schools is that even when they work, and not all of them do, the lessons from those schools have not been used to change policy so that we benefit all schools. So for example, what's one of the advantages that charter schools have over public schools? Well, they can hire teachers that they want to serve the kids, right? They can, if they need a desk, they can just go to Target, get that desk, right? A school district take you 6 months to get a desk. You got to go through all this rigmarole to hire a teacher, and it may not be a teacher with the right credential. So we need to find ways to streamline regulations, and the state should do that. We need to find ways to level the playing field between the charter schools, especially the good ones. And I want to, the data's clear that a lot of them are not good, and there's a lot of corruption in some of those schools. But we're not learning from success. And it sounds so obvious, but it doesn't happen in education. And that's why I give examples of places that are achieving success, and I can name charter schools that are doing the same thing. But again, why don't our policymakers and why don't the educators also say, okay, what is that school doing differently? And I've taken people out to see this because seeing is believing. And if you've never seen it, after a while, you start to believe it can't be done.
What can local entrepreneurs who do want to invest, like right here in Austin, do? How could they bend the curve in terms of if they're thinking about equity, they're thinking about justice? Would it be literacy like you're talking about? Would it be, some people are, again, helping in the context of COVID-19 with food justice? What can they really do?
Well, we have such pressing and immediate needs right now, so I want to, commend those who have stepped up to make sure people have access to food. But we got to go beyond that. We have, we live in a rich country, and we should be able to do more than just make sure people eat. Although, again, I don't want to minimize the importance of that. I would say follow the example of Todd Williams in Dallas. Devise a plan rooted in data, because we need to make sure the resources go precisely to the place where we know we're going to make a difference. If we make a commitment, for example, to third grade reading proficiency, so kids are reading at proficiency by third grade, that has long-term implications. We made a commitment to early childhood education, that every child was in a high-quality preschool, huge benefits across a child's lifetime. So we have good research about what it takes to start to reduce poverty. Raj Jetty at Harvard has done many studies showing that when you move people toward opportunity, you can improve outcomes for kids and for families. So we need to use that research to guide our strategies where we are. Austin is a great city. It needs to be great for everybody, not just for those who have the wealth.
Somebody had a great question about what can we do to stop the over-identification of Black male students as being emotionally and intellectually somehow marginalized. They're punished at high rates. And I would ask the same thing about Black girls too. What can we do? Sure. What can we do for the boys and girls? And I know the person really asked about Black boys because Black boys have a special stigma attached to them, but I'd say Black girls have a stigma as well. So we're gonna talk about
Absolutely.
both.
So I talked before about the discipline gaps that we see, but the same thing is true with special education. Black children are more likely to be identified as having a learning disability and to be placed in restrictive learning environments where their needs are not met. So let me be clear, if special education were done well, we'd have no problem because every child has a learning plan and that's supposed to be designed to identify what the needs of that child are. If that plan was honored, we would see those kids getting their needs met. Problem is, in a lot of schools, that's not how it works. Special ed is a place where we put kids that we don't know how to serve or don't want to serve, and they languish, even though we're spending more money on those kids, but we're spending money ineffectively. That's why I will never say money's the solution. Money spent wisely and invested in the right ways is where we make a difference. So, whether we're talking about discipline or special education, we have to ask questions. Why are these kids being placed? Are their needs being met? Which teachers are referring the most kids? Because usually that's a reflection of their own lack of ability to meet that child's needs. So again, you don't solve that problem by blaming that teacher and attacking that teacher, but that teacher clearly needs help if they're referring lots of kids to special ed because they don't know how to serve their needs. Now, we do have kids out there who have learning disabilities of all kinds, but we also have good research on how to serve those kids. We know how to serve kids who are autistic, kids who are dyslexic. We have good research about how to do this. The real problem is the gap between the research and the practice. That's the gap we need to close. We do it in healthcare. We don't do it in education.
Now, somebody had a great question about the middle class. How do we convince middle class parents to keep their kids in racially diverse schools and not to sort of flee to either private or charter schools or racially segregated homogeneous districts?
What we have to realize, and this is what I was alluding to before, that we're all in this together, right? That it's not in our interest to allow certain kids to be relegated to an inferior education because those are the kids who are going to end up structurally disenfranchised, underemployed, more likely to go to prison. So we're spending money on them either way. Now the question is, could we invest early to make those kinds of negative outcomes less likely? One of the ways to do that is to make sure they have access to good education. And so middle-class families of all races need to be advocates for the schools that right now are under-resourced. And they have to say those kids need a better education, better educational opportunities, and they have to push for it. But the problem is, and you see this a lot in a lot of affluent families, people get very selfish, right? They're thinking about their kids, and they're not thinking about everybody else's kids. Right now, because schools may not be open, affluent people are saying, okay, I'll get my kid in a pod, we'll do homeschooling, we'll hire our own teacher, we'll take care of ours. Well, what about the kids that they're gonna be in school with when later? Well, how do we make sure they're getting an opportunity too? So we have to think bigger. We can't be selfish. Selfishness is what's one of the things really undermining this country.
Yeah, that's the empathy gap. And I'm gonna close with a question on that empathy gap. How do we provide positive reinforcement when people do good things? Example, teacher spends extra time to help students excel. A school reorganizes its resources such that conditions improve. Negative reinforcement when people do bad things. This person says a school fails to meet standardized test requirements. I'm not sure about that. A teacher says or does something racist. Do we use grant money as an incentive, public recognition, or shaming? Should schools be given more assistance based on their demographics?
So those are complex questions. Each one requires a lot more time. I would say this, that we know that pressure and threats do not lead to improvement in schools, right? There's no evidence that just because you shame a school and shame the people who work there, that school will suddenly start getting better. Opposite. People who can will flee that school. So what does change outcomes is following those 5 essentials I named before, putting in highly skilled teachers, highly skilled administrators to work in that school, getting parents involved. Those are the things that we need to do. Do we need to acknowledge and reward people who do it well? Absolutely. We need to shine a light and show them this is what it takes to get better outcomes, because people don't see it sometimes. So I think we could do a lot more to point out where we're getting good results. You know, here's a metaphor I will use. I'm a gardener, and I've been doing a lot more gardening now during quarantine. And you know, I'm very proud of my garden. I got tomatoes, I got peppers, I got eggplant, I got all kinds of things in my garden. But I tried to grow some cantaloupe last year. They didn't grow. And I thought, oh, it must be the soil. Then I went to my neighbor's house. He had plenty of cantaloupes. And he was explaining, well, cantaloupes need a lot more water. And I wasn't giving them enough water. What I didn't do was to go back to my garden and start blaming the cantaloupes, right? I said, there's something wrong with these seeds. I said, I'm the farmer, I'm the gardener. I need to do something differently. If I get the conditions right, my garden will flourish. That's the way we should think about schools. We get the conditions right, the children will flourish. When they're not flourishing, it means we haven't gotten the conditions right. And that's what we should focus on.
Okay, that's great. I love that you're a gardener. That's great. That's great. This question says that, Dr. Noguera, your presentation highlights the tension between education being perceived as an individual right versus a collective good, and how this is highly racialized. The federal administration has capitalized on this moment to privatize schools. Do you think the pandemic lends an opportunity window to move toward a more collective vision for public education? If so, what recommendations do you have for promoting that shift and goals for racial equity, and basically the shift away from the individual to the collective?
Well, I'll tell you honestly, without leadership, that idea gets lost, because you know, we have 2 traditions in this country. We have the tradition of rugged individualism, right? Every person get a gun to protect themselves. We'll go out to the frontier, kill Indians and take their land to build a home for us. That's one American tradition. The other tradition is neighbors helping neighbors, working together to improve. That's also a part. So I think about this. After every crisis, right? Usually, we haven't seen it as much during the pandemic because we've been sheltering alone. But I was in the Bay Area during the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. The A's were playing the Giants, and the Bay Bridge collapsed. So did the Cypress Freeway. What we saw was strangers helping strangers. The first people to scale that freeway were Black residents from the Acorn Housing Projects in West Oakland. They scaled the freeway to free people from their cars. When they freed people from their cars, they didn't say, what color are you? What's your sexual orientation? They freed whoever was stuck, right? During those moments of crisis, we saw the same thing in 9/11. People see the human connection is more important than race, religion, sexual, differences, whatever, right? We respond to the human need. What we need is leadership to say, let us work together to serve each other. One of the first things I did, my kids were mad at me when the pandemic started. I went out there to help distribute food because I knew the lines were growing long. And they said, you're in the category where you should be at home. You shouldn't be risking your life. But I know that when we just look out for ourselves, it actually contributes to the problem. And what I see in this country is we have too many people who feel powerless, who feel helpless, who are waiting for someone to get elected, waiting for Superman, waiting for something to happen. And that's what we got to do. We got to stop waiting. We got to take action where we live to help our neighbors, to help those who are more vulnerable.
Well said. Here's a question from Dr. Bumpus, Eileen Bumpus. Where would a school district that has pervasive racism and racist actions in the classroom and in sports begin to address racism?
You got to start at the top, and you got to make sure that at the leadership levels, board, superintendent, first of all, they have to believe it, and then they send a very clear message that every child will be treated with dignity and respect, And if that is not occurring, there will be consequences. We should have professional standards because every child needs that. And that's almost like, it doesn't matter what your race is, right? That should be the case. And then there has to be consequences. When people violate that, they need to be held accountable, and we need to do something about it. But unless you have leadership, it's very hard to address the individual bigot out there who is harming children, who is engaged in behavior that undermines kids and hurts them. So and unfortunately, it starts at the top. Now, individual teachers listen to this. I say there's a lot you can do in your classroom to make sure kids who are with you feel respected and safe and supported, but that may not benefit everybody in the school.
You mentioned low-funded schools and not having the best teachers. How can we replace bad teachers in the school system that are not benefiting the students, especially in Black areas?
You know, again, this is where we have to look at policy, and we have to have, I support unions, but a union doesn't mean you have a job for life if you're no good at the job, right? We need to evaluate people. Not everybody should be a teacher, right? And if a person is shown that they can't serve the population of kids that they were hired to serve, then they should not continue to have a job. But they need to be evaluated by someone who actually knows teaching and understands the work. But teaching job should not be a job for life. You should be able to. We have to make it more difficult to become a teacher, right? And what I mean by that is we need to raise the bar. What kinds of training and education you need to become a teacher, so that we're more like countries in Western Europe and Japan, where our teachers are highly skilled professionals, and we have to make it easier for people who are not good at it to be able to get out of the profession. Teachers should not be a profession where just anybody could be a teacher, and regardless of how good you are, you have a job for as long as we need a warm body in the classroom. That undermines education. It undermines the respect we have for teaching as a profession, and it hurts kids.
And some of that's connected to the gendered nature of poverty, the fact that more women are teachers, around still 70%, and we don't value the work of women, and we don't pay women equally, and we still never passed the Equal Rights Amendment as well in this
Absolutely.
country. Will the reopening of schools intensify racial inequities among Black students, Black and Latinx students? How can we ensure that Black and Latinx students are supported during the reopening process?
You know, that's something that's been weighing on my mind, because I'm concerned that many school districts are preoccupied with the logistics of reopening safely, and they should be. We have to make sure that kids are safe, that the adults who teach them are also safe, that we're doing social distancing, all that, very important when schools are allowed to reopen. But this should also be an opportunity to improve what we do, to make schools better than they were, not just return to them as they were. And we need to make sure that, for example, kids are doing meaningful work that gets them engaged, that taps into their natural curiosity. We need to make sure that teachers get clear guidance on how to deliver instruction that motivates kids. That's what we need to be focused on. Too many kids feel bored and alienated in school, schools not meeting their needs. We can do so much better, but we can only do that if we provide clear guidance on what it looks like when we do it well. Edutopia, for those listeners out there who are educators, has great resources available free to the public on how to do great project-based learning, great science and math while kids are at home even. So there are resources out there. The sad thing is that they're often not being utilized.
And that leads me to a question, yes, about action steps. What can, right now, I'm going to go tick off, but I'm going to ask these as separate questions. Right now, first, what should parents be doing? Especially, you know what, I'll say both parents who are in situations where they are on the margins and they're really wondering how they're going to get through the fall semester for children, but also parents who are in affluent school districts who are right here on this call, who want to know how they can help, not just their own children, but really, like you said, help other people's children, get away from that selfishness, that narcissism, that meism. So what can parents do right now before the start of the school year?
Well, if you are doing one of those learning pods, and I know many parents are, make sure that those pods include kids from diverse backgrounds. So it's not just your kids or kids like your kids that are getting those opportunities. Be an advocate for the children who may be in those under-resourced schools. Joseph Nocera, who writes for the New York Times, wrote an op-ed a few years ago called "How the Middle Class Helped Ruin Public Schools." And he used himself as an example and talked about moving from the city to Vermont so his kids could go into nice, affluent schools, all white schools. And he said, had I stayed, I'd been an advocate for better education for all kids in the public system. That's the way we have to think about it. When we see ourselves as connected to our neighbors, we then advocate for those neighbors, and all of us benefit. And so it's shifting our lens away from ourselves, thinking about the collective good.
And what can students do? What should students be doing right now? Especially, we have so many students who are interested in anti-racism, racial equity. We know one of the things that we've seen with Black Lives Matter, the youth are leading us, and they did in the 1960s and 50s as well. They're the ones who desegregated schools, and they took on the mob violence, Little Rock 9, Greensboro, North Carolina, sit-ins. What can students be doing, especially those students who, my students want to be engaged, including high school and younger students who they know that we have this justice fight, this struggle happening. What can they do?
Well, they need to raise questions about what they're learning, about how inclusive is the curriculum? Why are they reading authors of diverse backgrounds in their classes? They need to raise questions about who's being hired in the schools. Do they have a diverse staff of teachers teaching them? And if not, why not? When students do the research, so they're informed about what's going on in their schools and their communities, they can use that to organize more effectively and to advocate more effectively for the needs. So it's not good enough to act out of a sense of injustice because you're aware of it. You have to be armed with some data and information so you know what the problem is that we're trying to address. And so that we could, because that's one of the things that concerns me. We're seeing protests all around the country over police brutality and injustice, and that's a good thing. But we know people are not going to protest forever. People can get tired after a while. They have to go back to work. What will come out of those protests? We have to think now, what are the tangible demands that we can make that could lead to some significant improvement? And it concerns me that I don't see that enough of that right now.
And when we think about teachers and administrators and even community leaders, what should they be doing right now? By community leaders, I mean not just grassroots folks, them included, but folks who are friends of schools, folks who are on boards of trustees, including at places like UT Austin, but AISD. What should they be doing right here, right now, in terms of to try to stop and defeat this structural racism, this deep inequality that you've shown us is coming out of structures, institutions, ideologies, interpersonal?
I say get involved, do the work of analyzing what's happening in your community. Don't just focus on schools, focus on what's happening in the lives of the children and in your communities, so you know what kinds of strategies are going to be necessary to begin to address the problems. But the main thing is to be involved. Don't just sit on the sidelines. There are a lot of things. I was in Little Rock, Arkansas last year. There are parents there that are, Central High School, which Dwight Eisenhower integrated with the 87th Airborne in 1957, is segregated once again, yes, and under threat from the state. And rather than the state investing, the state's taking resources out. Parents there have organized and they have allies to draw attention to it and to do something about it. We need action like that happening throughout the country in a sustained way.
And Dr. Noguera, my last question, Pedro, Dean Noguera, my friend, is the empathy gap. What can we do to close that vis-a-vis our children? There's so many people. We've got a very interracial, multiracial webinar here. There's hundreds. What can we do? And so many people talk to me about that. They want that gap to be closed. What can we do?
So I'll put it simply. We wrote a book about this called The Crisis of Connection. and it was a lot about the empathy gap and what to do to overcome it. So you close the empathy gap by reminding ourselves that we're all in this together, right? That our human connections ultimately are what's most important. So I'll give you an example. Back, I think it was 2014, when we were worried about Ebola as a pandemic. And so the reaction was, when it broke out in West Africa, was for countries to say, let's quarantine those countries. Let's not allow anybody from those countries to travel here. And if anybody who is a health worker goes there, we're going to quarantine them. And literally, there were nurses being quarantined at the airport in Newark. And then what happened is, health professionals said, no, you don't isolate those countries. That's not going to stop the pandemic. What you have to do is go there and help them. And so there was one Liberian, he's an epidemiologist at Harvard, who was from the same neighborhood, a neighborhood in Monrovia called West Point, where the Ebola had broken out. What did he do? He flew back to his country and started educating people about how to deal with people who get sick. Because what was happening is, people were taking their sick relatives in and getting infected. And basic educational strategies about how to deal with the sick helped to abate the Ebola outbreak, right? So imagine what happened in this country if all of us had been on the same page about how to deal with this pandemic. If we had gotten clear guidance from Washington, say, let's all shut things down for a while, let's all wear masks. Wow, we'd be in a very different place right now than we are. And so it comes back to thinking about the other person. It sounds so obvious, but the human species would not have survived this far if we all just looked out for ourselves. We have to remember that altruism is our greatest resource. It's the only thing we have to survive into the future. But we have to think about it, because if we think global warming is just a threat to some, then we're delusional. These threats we face, global warming, inequality, migration, we have to respond to these as collective dilemmas, not individual personal problems.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Dean, Dr. Pedro Noguera, he just gave this brilliant talk, The Search for Racial Justice in Education, Uprooting Structural Racism. He is the Dean of the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California, and really one of the world's most foremost experts on education, anti-racism, racial justice, and equality in our school systems globally. So we've really been privileged and honored. Thank you so much, Pedro, my friend, for joining us. This has been really educational. I'm so excited. I think this is a real opportunity. Everybody here who's on the call, thank you for supporting us at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. We are an anti-racist research center. This is a generational opportunity that we all have to try to transform American democracy. And we've had real action steps. We're gonna, this webinar has been recorded. We're interested in social impact. And for people who want to know more about Dr. Noguera's work, that's going to be available, and certainly the work of the center. So thank you so much to Emily Dunkley, the center's program administrator, and to all of the supporters of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. This has been a William C. Powers keynote lecture, and we will see you soon. This is our continuing education and social impact anti-racist webinars are going to continue into August, September, October, November. We're just going to continue until we meet collectively as a community and are transforming these situations and these issues. So thank you so much, and we will see you soon.